Hi, this is a short overview of cell membranes and transport into and out of cells. So as you recall, adjacent neighboring cells are often directly connected through things like the plasmodesmata in plant cells and gap junctions in animal cells. These are pores that actually connect the cytosol from one cell to another, and therefore small molecules can easily pass through. But what about larger molecules, or what about, again, things from the outside? How does the cell protect itself but still allow important materials to be imported and exported from the cell? And the answer is the plasma membrane. It's actually quite amazing. It is a dynamic, selectively permeable membrane. That means that it allows some things to pass through quite easily, and others, it has to regulate and moderate their passage. So what we're going to see here is that the plasma membrane is made up of primarily amphipathic phospholipids that form a bilayer, and we've already talked about that. There are also peripheral proteins as well as carbohydrates that are involved in communication with other cells, as well as important transmembrane integral proteins. And there's also cholesterol, which serves as a support molecule that helps give some rigidity to the plasma membrane. All of these components can move around within the plasma membrane, so you should think of it as a fluid type of situation. Now, again, membrane fluidity is going to be impacted by a variety of factors. Temperature impacts fluidity, the amount of saturated fats in the tails of the phospholipids, the level of cholesterol. All of these things will affect how freely molecules can move from one side to the other. Small nonpolar molecules can pass readily through the plasma membrane, whereas larger polar or charged molecules cannot. When we think about how these small molecules can move across, it's important to recognize they can do so without the input of energy. This is called passive transport, and this happens through diffusion. So diffusion involves what we call a concentration gradient. Molecules will tend to move from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration automatically. No energy needed. That's what we could call a downhill movement because no energy is required. So our small nonpolar molecules will easily do this. Larger molecules and those that are polar or charged are going to need assistance. And we call this facilitated diffusion. So it's still going downhill, going with the concentration gradient, but they need specific transport protein channels to go through. What about charged molecules, ions? It turns out that ions can diffuse through, but they must go through a specific ion channel. And this is, again, a protein transport membrane channel that has a little core that will allow a specific type of ion to pass through. And you have to realize that these channels can be open or closed, depending upon the conditions of the cell. Water moves through the cell through diffusion as well, but water is special, and so it gets its own terminology. The diffusion of water is called osmosis. And again, water will have a tendency freely to move from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. This is important because, again, cells are in aqueous environments, and therefore the level or concentration of water inside the cell is going to be obviously affected by the concentration outside the cell. So if a cell is put into a hypertonic solution, that means that the concentration of water inside the cell is higher than outside the cell. It's going to cause water to move outside the cell or to shrink. If it's in a hypotonic solution, the reverse will happen. The concentration of water will be greater outside the cell than inside the cell, and therefore water will want to move into the cell. Plants have a cell wall, and therefore they can maintain their shape readily, but when water does move inside the cell, it plumps up that cell and it becomes turgid. When water moves out of the cell, it becomes flaccid. Now, what about a situation where the water outside the cell is the same as the water concentration inside of the cell? That's called isotonic, and there will not be any net movement of water in that situation. Now, as I said, ions need special pores or ion channels to move through. And again, if we think about the membrane, not only is the concentration of the chemical important to determine if it's going to move from an area of high concentration to a low concentration freely without energy, but there's also a voltage component or an electrical component to membranes. So it's important to understand the membrane has membrane potential, electric membrane potential, with a positive charge on the outside of the cell and a negative charge on the inside of the cell. Transport proteins generate voltage across the membrane. These are called electrogenic pumps. In bacteria, they're called proton pumps. The pumping of hydrogen cations transfers the positive charged cation from the cytoplasm to the extracellular solution. And thus it builds up a higher concentration of positively charged hydrogens on one side of the membrane to the other. That creates this concentration gradient that will allow things to come through readily with those hydrogen ions. Cotransport is when the protein will actually couple the downhill diffusion of the solute to the uphill transport of a second substance against the concentration gradient. So when things are going, again, against the concentration gradient, that's active transport. Energy is required. And it's the coupling of the cations coming back through that provides that energy. So as you can see, the plasma membrane is really important.